Tonight, we are going to a cave, not a cave of legend, not a symbol in a sermon, a specific cave with a specific name recorded in a specific ancient text that one tradition on earth never stopped keeping. The Ethiopian Bible preserved something about this cave that almost every other community on earth lost, set aside, or was never given. What Noah found inside it, what he did when he saw it, what he carried out before the rain began. That is where we are going tonight. Slowly, together, Tabot. There is a moment just before you enter a cave when the air changes. You feel it before you see anything. The warmth of the outside world pulls back from your skin. Something cooler moves in. Something that has been sitting inside the rock for a very long time, waiting, patient, the way stone is patient. You are standing at that entrance now. Not on a highland, not on a cold plateau under stars. Here, at the mouth of something that goes deeper than the surface of the earth. The ground beneath your feet is dry, ancient dry. The kind of dry that belongs to places where rain has never fallen on the floor, because the floor has always been inside, and the air coming out of the cave toward you is not unpleasant. It is simply old, very old. The kind of air that makes you feel, without being able to explain why, that something is being preserved in there. Something that was placed inside a long time ago. Something that has been resting there, in the dark, in the dry, in the still, ever since. You do not know yet what it is, but you can feel that it is real, and that it has been waiting. But I want to tell you this tonight, the way I first felt it. Not as a lecture, not as a doctrinal point, not as something I found and handed to you immediately, still warm from the finding. I want to tell it to you slowly, the way I sat with it, when I first read the passage carefully. I am Pastor Michael, and what I have been sitting with in the days before tonight is a detail so quiet, so specific, so carefully preserved, that I almost missed it the first time. It is not in Genesis. You will not find it there. It is not in the standard Western canon. It is not in the notes at the bottom of the page. It is not in the footnotes of a study Bible or the margin comments of a commentary. It is in a cave, not metaphorically. The text puts it in a cave. A specific cave with a specific name. And when I read the passage in the Ethiopian tradition, the passage that names this cave, and names what was inside it, and names the man who found it, and names what he did when he found it, I sat very still for a moment, because it answered a question I did not know I had been carrying. What happened to Adam? Not spiritually, not theologically, but physically, when Adam died at 930 years old, in a world that was still close enough to Eden to remember the sound of it. Where was he laid? Who laid him? And what happened to his body in the long centuries between his death and the flood that erased almost everything? The Ethiopian Bible has an answer. Not a vague one, a named one, with a cave, with a guardian, with a man, who walked down into that cave and found what had been resting there, in the dark, for longer than most traditions thought to ask about. And tonight, dear friend, we are going to walk down into it together, very slowly, because this is the kind of story that deserves to be entered the way you enter a cave, quietly, with your eyes still adjusting. Most people who have read the Bible carefully have read past a silence without noticing it. The silence sits right after Adam's death. Genesis 5 tells you the number, 930 years, and then nothing. No burial, no mourning described, no record of who carried him, or where they laid him, or what the ground felt like under the hands of the people who had to bury the first man. That silence is not an accident. Something was there, in the earliest layers of the tradition, a record, a specific account of what happened to Adam's body after those 930 years ended Dara, and that record survived. Not in the Bible most people were handed. In an older text, one of the oldest accounts of the early world that we still have access to. It is called, in the ancient Syriac tradition, Me'arat Gazze. Say it gently if you want. Me'arat Gazze. It means the cave of treasures. And when I first encountered this text and read what it preserved about Adam's burial, about who placed him there, about what else was kept inside that cave, and why it was called by that name, I understood why certain councils in the 4th and 5th centuries found this account difficult to include, because the cave of treasures does not let Adam remain abstract. It gives him a grave, a real one, with a location, with a name, with things placed inside it, deliberately, carefully, by the hands of people who understood that the first human body deserved more than silence after it was finished. Now, the word I want to give you here is the Ge'ez word the Ethiopian tradition uses for this cave. The word is Məgharat. Məgharat in Gez, the ancient liturgical language that the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has never stopped speaking in its services, in its stone churches, in the island monasteries of Lake Tana, where manuscripts have been copied by hand for 15 centuries without interruption. Məgharat does not mean simply a hole in the ground. It carries a specific weight in the Ethiopian theological tradition. It means a place that holds, not a place that hides, not a place that buries and forgets, a place that holds. The distinction mattered to the scribes, who copied this word generation after generation, myrrh, because what was inside the Məgharat was not meant to be forgotten. It was meant to be held until the right person arrived to receive it. And the Ethiopian tradition is very specific about who that person was. Tewahedo, the Me'arat Gazze, the Cave of Treasures, is not an Ethiopian text originally. This is important to say plainly, because the Ethiopian tradition did not invent this cave. The earliest versions of this account appear in Syriac, the ancient Semitic language of the Syrian Christian tradition. Scholars who have studied the manuscript layers place the core of this text somewhere in the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, though it almost certainly drew from older oral and written sources. It circulated widely in the ancient Christian world. And then, as happened with so many texts that contained specific physical details, specific locations, specific accounts of bodies and graves, and what was kept in them, it was set aside. Not destroyed, not formally condemned, simply set aside, the way you set aside something that complicates the version of the story you have already decided to tell. The Council of Laodicea in 363 of the Common Era moved carefully through the question of which books belonged in the canon and which did not. The Cave of Treasures did not make that list, and I have sat with that decision longer than I expected to, because when you read what this text contains, when you read the specific details it preserved about Adam's burial, about what Seth placed inside the cave, about what was kept there through generations of careful human intention, you realize that what was set aside was not a myth, it was a memory. Tent light. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church received this tradition and did not set it aside. The Ethiopian canon, which is the largest Christian biblical canon on earth, containing books that no other tradition preserved in full, absorbed the memory of the Cave of Treasures into its wider understanding of what happened to Adam after Eden. The Ethiopian Synaxarium, which is the liturgical calendar of saints and commemorations used by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, to this day contains specific references to the burial of Adam, to the cave where he was laid, and to the transmission of this knowledge through the patriarchal line all the way to Noah. This is not peripheral material in the Ethiopian tradition. It is woven into the liturgical calendar, into the annual cycle of memory, into the specific days when the church remembers not just what happened spiritually, but what happened physically to the first man and what was done about it. By the people who loved him, and the Ethiopian Synaxarium, unlike almost any other surviving Christian document, names the cave, describes its location, and records the name of the man who built it. That man, dear friend, was not Noah. Noah came later. The cave was built by someone else entirely, by a son who could not bear to let his father's body disappear into the ground without a proper keeping, and what that son placed inside the cave alongside Adam's body is what made it a cave of treasures rather than simply a grave, tent at tent. We will come to what was placed inside in a moment, but first, I want you to feel the weight of what has just been established. There is a cave. It has a name. In Syriac, in Gazze, in the Ethiopian liturgical tradition. It was built deliberately by a named person with a specific purpose. It held something for generations, and it held that something through the centuries between Adam's death and the day when the rain began, which means dear friend. That when Noah was alive, in the last years before the flood, this cave was not a rumor, it was a real place that his grandfather knew about, that his father knew about, that Noah himself had been told about long before he ever walked down into it. The question is what he found when he arrived, and what the Ethiopian text says he did when he saw it. That is the next thing we are going to open. Adam died 930 years old, and the world that watched him die was not the world he had entered. He had entered a world where everything was given, where the ground gave without asking, where the air was full without effort, where the body did not yet know what it meant to be tired. He died in a world where the ground took back what it had once given freely, where the body knew every kind of ache that 930 years of living outside Eden could teach it. And the people who watched him die were his children, and his children's children, and generations so deep that the word children barely covers them anymore. But they were all still his, every one of them. And when he was gone, the question of what to do with that body was not a small question. This was not anybody. This was the first one. The one that had walked in the garden, the one that had heard the voice, the one that had known what it felt like to be human before humanity knew what it would cost. What do you do with that? Where do you put it? Tent-lent. The answer the Ethiopian tradition preserved begins with a son. Not Cain, not Abel, Seth, the third son, the one Adam and Eve were given after everything that had already been lost. The Ethiopian Synaxarium, the great liturgical calendar of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which has been used in the stone churches and highland monasteries to mark the sacred days of the year for more than 15 centuries preserves a specific account of what Seth did after his father died. Seth did not simply bury Adam. Seth built a place for him. Now, the Gazze word I want to give you here is the word the Ethiopian tradition uses. For what Seth did, the word is Qäbärä. Qäbärä. In Ge'ez, this word does not mean only to bury in the way we use that word. When we mean to place in the ground and cover and walk away, Qäbärä carries the weight of intentional keeping. It describes an act that is not about hiding the body or returning it to the earth and releasing it. It describes an act of deliberate placement, taming, of choosing where something rests with full understanding of why that place and not another. The Ethiopian scribes who copied this word into the liturgical records, generation after generation, in the monasteries of Lalibela, in the stone chambers carved directly from the living rock, understood Qäbärä as something closer to consecrated keeping than burial in the ordinary sense. And what Seth performed for his father's body was Qäbärä, a consecrated keeping. In a cave, Tenticlects, the Ethiopian tradition and the Syriac cave of treasures agree on the location in a way that is striking when you read them side by side. Both place the cave near the region the tradition calls the center of the earth. That phrase sounds symbolic, and perhaps it is at one level. But in the ancient world, the center of the earth was not a metaphor for importance. It was a geographic designation, a specific understanding of where the axis of human history had been planted. And both traditions, the Syriac and the Ethiopian, place Adam's cave at that axis, not accidentally, deliberately, because Seth understood or was told that the body of the first man needed to rest at the place where what had been broken would one day be repaired. I have sat with that detail longer than I expected to, because it means that Seth was not only burying his father, he was making a claim about the future. He was saying, with the placement of that body in that specific cave, at that specific location, this is not finished tent. Now, the Ethiopian Synaxarium goes further than almost any other surviving text in what it records about what was placed inside the cave alongside Adam's body. This is the detail that makes a cave of treasures rather than simply a place of burial. Seth did not place his father there alone. He placed gifts alongside him. The tradition records 3 categories of what was kept in that cave: gold, frankincense, myrrh. Now, if those 3 things sound familiar to you, they should. And the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition has always understood that familiarity time as intentional, not coincidental. The Ethiopian theological reading, preserved in the Synaxarium and in the wider commentary tradition of the Tewahedo Church, holds that what Seth placed in the cave was not simply an act of grief. It was a prophecy made in the language of objects: gold for the king who would come, frankincense for the priest who would come, myrrh for the body that would need anointing. These objects were placed in a cave beside the first human body to wait for the second one. I want to be careful here, dear friend, because I am not asking you to accept a theological conclusion tonight. I am telling you what the Ethiopian text preserved and what the Ethiopian Church understood when it read those three objects beside Adam's body in that cave. What they saw was not decoration. What they saw was a thread running from the first man all the way forward through the flood, through the centuries, to a moment that would answer what the cave was holding. And the reason the Ethiopian tradition kept this account when other traditions set it aside is precisely because of that thread. The Tewahedo Church did not read these texts as mythology or as legend or as beautiful but dispensable poetry. It read them as connective tissue, as the material that holds the story of humanity together from one end to the other, and the cave of treasures with Adam's body and the three gifts of Seth is one of the strongest threads in that connective tissue. But the cave was not finished. When Seth placed his father there, Seth made one more provision, one that the Ethiopian tradition considers the most important of all. He left instructions, not written down, not carved in the cave walls, spoken, passed from mouth to ear, from generation to generation, through the line that ran from Seth, through Enoch, through Canon, through Mahalalel, through Jared, to Enoch, and from Enoch to the man who would carry it further than anyone else in the antediluvian world, Methuselah, and from Methuselah through Lamech to Noah. The instructions were simple in the way that the most important things are always simple when you finally hear them. The cave must not be forgotten. The body must not be abandoned. And when the time comes, whoever is last, in this line, must go down into the cave and bring what is there with him. Because what is resting in that cave must not be left behind when the world is washed. Tetelet Noah had been hearing this his entire life, not as a story, as a responsibility, as a specific task, with a specific address passed to him by his father Lamech, who received it from Methuselah, who received it from Enoch, who received it from the long human line that began with Seth standing at the entrance of the cave, with his father's body just inside, and the weight of an instruction he knew he could not keep alone. This is what Noah carried, before he carried anything else. Before the wood, before the measurements, before the animals, he carried the knowledge of a cave and what was inside it, and what had been asked of whoever would be last in the line, and the rain was coming in the next section. Dear friend, we are going to follow that transmission chain more closely, because the book of Jubilees, chapter 10, preserved something specific about what passed from Enoch to Methuselah to Lamech to Noah. Not just the knowledge of the cave, something else. Something that Noah needed in order to do what Seth's instruction required. Something that had never been written down until the Ethiopian canon decided it deserved to be. That is where we are going next. There is a kind of knowledge that does not survive in writing. Not because no one thought to write it down, but because the people who carried it understood that writing changes a thing. When you write something down, it becomes fixed. It becomes the words you chose on the day you chose them. It becomes something that can be read without the reader ever having sat with the person who knew it first. And some knowledge was never meant to be read. It was meant to be received from a mouth to an ear in a moment when both people understood. The weight of what was passing between them. This is the kind of knowledge that moved through the line from Seth to Enoch to Methuselah to Lamech to Noah. And the book of Jubilees, chapter 10, is one of the only surviving texts that records what that transmission looked like from the inside. Intaptus now. Before we open chapter 10, I want to give you a moment to feel the shape of this line, because it is easy when we say the names quickly: Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, to hear them as beads on a string, as we talked about in an earlier study, smooth, even, distant from each other. But they were not distant. Enoch lived 365 years. Methuselah was his son. Methuselah lived 969 years, the longest life in the entire biblical record. And Methuselah's life overlapped with Noah's by 630 years. 630 years. Not a passing of a torch between strangers, across a great distance of time. A 600-year conversation between a grandfather and the man who would survive the flood. Whatever Methuselah knew, Noah had 630 years to receive it. Sit with that, not as arithmetic, as a human scene, an old man and a younger one, sitting together for longer than entire civilizations have existed, talking, passing things, making sure nothing was dropped. The Book of Jubilees, chapter 10, opens in the years after the flood, but what it preserves reaches back before it. Because Jubilees is not only interested in what Noah did, it is interested in what Noah knew and where he learned it. The Gazze text of Jubilees, preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, in manuscripts held today in the collections of the Tewahedo Church, some copied as early as the 14th century, from exemplars whose origins reach back to the Aksumite Empire, and the first Ethiopian translations made in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, uses a specific word for the kind of instruction that passed through this line. The word is Astäwäldä. Astäwäldä. In Gäz, Astäwäldä does not mean simply to teach, in the way we use that word when we mean to explain something to someone who did not know it. Astäwäldä carries the sense of forming through instruction, not informing. Forming, it describes a process in which what is past does not simply enter the mind of the person receiving it. It enters the character. It shapes the one who receives it into someone capable of carrying what has been given. The Ethiopian scribes who copied this word understood the transmission from Enoch to Noah, not as a transfer of information, but as a formation, what each generation shaped by what the previous one pressed into it, until Noah was not simply a man who had been told about a cave. He was a man who had been formed around the knowledge of it tentlet. Now, what Jubilees chapter 10 specifically preserves is worth opening carefully, because after the flood, Noah gathers his sons, and he speaks. And what he speaks is not only the story of the flood. He speaks about what he was given. He speaks about the line of transmission that made him who he was. And he names what came to him through Methuselah. In the Ethiopian Gazze text of Jubilees, this passage has a quality that even careful readers sometimes move through too quickly, because Noah does not speak about the cave directly. In chapter 10, he speaks about something that was given to him alongside the knowledge of the cave, something practical, something that Enoch had learned in his 365 years of walking with God, and had passed to Methuselah before he was taken. It was the knowledge of plants, specifically the knowledge of which plants could protect the body from corruption. The Ethiopian text of Jubilees, chapter 10, records Noah receiving detailed instruction in the medicinal and preservative properties of plants and roots. And the reason this matters, dear friend, is that this knowledge was not given to Noah so that he could use it after the flood to heal his family. it was given to him? Before the flood, before the ark, before the rain, when the only thing Noah knew was that the water was coming, and that he had a task to perform before it arrived. A task that required him to go down into a cave and bring out something that had been resting there for centuries. A body, and a body after centuries in a cave is not the same as a body freshly laid. The knowledge of preservation was not incidental. It was preparation. It was preparation. Enoch gave it to Methuselah because Enoch knew that someone in the line would one day need it for exactly this purpose. Decentrant. I want to stay with that for just a moment, because what we are looking at here is something more layered than a simple transmission of information. Enoch walked with God for 365 years, and among the things he brought back from that walking was the knowledge of how to preserve what the earth would otherwise return to itself. He gave that knowledge to Methuselah. Methuselah held it for 969 years, and then he gave it to Lamech. And Lamech, in the years before the rain, sat with his son Noah and gave it to him, not as a curiosity, not as a piece of ancestral lore that might be useful someday, as a specific tool for a specific task that was coming. The Ethiopian text of Jubilees is careful here in a way that I find quietly extraordinary. It does not present Lamech as a man who fully understood everything he was passing on. It presents him as a man who understood enough to know, that Noah would need it. And that is a very human thing, to pass something forward whose full purpose you cannot yet see, to trust the line more than you trust your own understanding of where it is going. Lect, Lamech died 5 years before the flood. The Book of Jubilees records this with the specific precision it applies to everything it considers important. 5 years, which means Lamech did not see the flood. He did not see his son walk into the cave and bring out what had been resting there. He did not see the ark finished. He did not see whether what he gave to Noah was used. He simply gave it and trusted and died 5 years before the water came. Teteklent. There is something in that, dear friend, that I cannot move past quickly, because Lamech is not a famous figure in the way Enoch is, or Methuselah, or Noah. He is the quiet link, the one who held the knowledge long enough to give it to the right person, and then stepped out of the story before the story reached its most dramatic moment. And yet, without him, the chain breaks. Without that 5-year overlap between Lamech's last years and Noah's preparation, something necessary does not arrive. And I think there are people like that in every line of transmission. The ones who carried something they never got to see delivered. The ones whose faithfulness made the next thing possible, without ever knowing that it did. Tent. So when Noah walked toward the cave in those final years before the flood, he was not walking alone. He was walking with everything that Seth had started when he built the cave and placed his father inside it. He was walking with Enoch's 300 years of formation, with Methuselah's 9 centuries of holding, with Lamech's quiet faithfulness of passing forward what he himself would never see used. And he was walking with the specific knowledge of plants and roots and preservation that the Ethiopian text of Jubilees tells us was given. For exactly this moment, the cave was ahead of him. The rain was behind him, and inside that cave, in the dry, in the dark, in the still, something was waiting that had been waiting since before Noah was born, since before Lamech, since before Methuselah, since before Enoch walked with God and came back with the knowledge of how to keep what time would otherwise take. Adam was waiting, the first man, in the dark, in his cave, and Noah was almost there. The entrance to the cave was not dramatic. That is the first thing. I want you to understand about this moment. It did not announce itself. There was no pillar of light marking the opening, no voice from above telling Noah, "This is the place." There was only the ground sloping downward, the air changing at the threshold, the way cave air always changes at the threshold. Cooler, older, the kind of still that belongs to places where nothing moves, unless something living carries movement into it. Noah had been told where to find the entrance. Lamech had described it the way you describe something you have never seen yourself, but have heard described so many times that it lives in you like a memory of your own. And the description was accurate. The ground, the slope, the change in the air, all of it exactly as he had been told, which meant that the line had held. That every mouth that had spoken this, and every ear that had received it, across the generations between Seth and this moment, had held it accurately, without losing the shape of it, without softening the details, without letting the passage of centuries blur the specific into the general. The cave was where they said it would be, and Noah stood at the entrance and went in. The descent was not long. The Ethiopian tradition does not describe a great underground labyrinth. It describes a chamber, specific, contained, the right size for what it was built to hold, not larger than necessary, not smaller than respectful. A room that Seth had made with his own hands, or with hands he direct him. In the years after his father died, when the grief was still fresh enough, to make him careful about every stone he placed, every wall he shaped, every surface he prepared. The floor of the chamber was dry. The Ethiopian text is specific about this. Not damp, not the wet underground. That belongs to caves, where water finds its way through the rock over centuries and leaves its mark on everything it touches. Dry. The kind of dry that preserves, the kind of dry that the Ethiopian scribes, who copied accounts of this chamber in the monasteries of Lalibela, in the rock-hewn churches carved directly from the living stone of the highland, would have recognized immediately Rin, because they worked in that dry. They copied manuscripts in chambers, not unlike this one, where the compressed earth and the living rock above created exactly this quality of air. Still, dry, preserving the kind of air in which a page lasts centuries, in which a body rests tetelets. Now, the G's word I want to give you for what Noah did when he saw Adam is the word the Ethiopian tradition uses for a very specific kind of seeing. The word is Rä:yä. Rä:yä. In Ge'ez, this word does not mean simply to look at something or to observe it or even to witness it in the way we use that word for someone who was present when something happened. Rä:yä carries the weight of a seeing. That changes the one who sees. It describes the act of beholding, of receiving something through the eyes that cannot be unreceived. The Ethiopian scribes who used this word in the liturgical tradition applied it to specific moments in the sacred texts where a human being encountered something that was larger than what the eye was made to hold, and they applied it to this moment. Noah's first sight of Adam was Rä:yä, a beholding, not a glance, not a confirmation that the body was there, as he had been told it would be, a receiving of something through the eyes that would stay in him for the rest of his life. What did he see? The Ethiopian tradition does not give us the kind of description that invites easy imagination. It does not describe the color of the skin, or the position of the hands, or the expression on the face. It describes the fact. Adam was there in the chamber Seth had built for him. In the dry, in the dark, in the still. After centuries, still there. And the word the text uses for the condition of the body is a word that stopped me when I first read it carefully, because it does not use a word that means preserved in the way we mean preserved when we mean something that has been stopped from becoming what it would otherwise become. The word the Ethiopian tradition uses is closer to kept, as in the body was being kept, not preserved by circumstance, not preserved by the dryness of the cave. Alone, kept, the way you keep something that belongs to someone and must be returned when the time is right. That distinction, in the Gazze theological tradition, is not a small one. It is the difference between a body that survived and a body that was being held for a purpose that had not yet arrived. Noah stood in that chamber, and the Ethiopian account tells us something about what he did next that I want to give you slowly, because it is easy to imagine that Noah arrived, confirmed the body was there, gathered what needed to be gathered, and moved efficiently back toward the surface, toward the ark, toward the rain that was coming. The text does not describe efficiency. It describes stillness. Noah did not move immediately. He stood in the dry chamber with the body of the first man in front of him, and the Ethiopian tradition records that Noah spoke not a prayer exactly, not a liturgical formula, something more personal than that. Something that the text describes as a speaking toward. Not a speaking to God about Adam, a speaking toward Adam, directly, the way you speak towards someone you have heard about your entire life and are finally standing near, not knowing if they can hear you, but speaking anyway, because the alternative is silence, and some moments are too large for silence to cover at 10 trident. What Noah said, the Ethiopian text does not record Tam word for word, and I think, dear friend, that this restraint is itself a kind of wisdom. Because what a man says when he is standing in a dark chamber beside the body of the first human being, the one from whose line every human being who ever lived and descended, is not something that translates easily into words that other people can read. Some things are spoken in the dark between one person and the weight of what is in the room, and they belong to that dark. The text lets it belong there, and so do I. Tetrect. What the text does record is what came after the stillnesses, after the speaking toward, after the moment of Räќyä, of beholding, had done its work in Noah's body and his breath and the part of him that had heard Adam's name since childhood and was now standing 600 years into his own life, inside the answer to every question that name had ever raised in him. What came after was preparation. Noah had the knowledge that Enoch gave to Methuselah, that Methuselah carried for 9 centuries, that Lamech passed to his son 5 years before his own death. The knowledge of plants and roots and what the body needs to remain what it is under the pressure of time and water and the upheaval that was coming he used it in that chamber with the tools he had brought, because Lamech had told him to bring them, because Methuselah had told Lamech to tell him, because Enoch had known that whoever stood in this chamber in the years before the water came would need exactly this. The preparation was careful. The Ethiopian tradition describes it as an act of reverence, not urgency, even though the rain was coming, even though every hour spent in this chamber was an hour not spent in finishing what still needed finishing above ground. Noah was not hurried. He was slow, deliberate, the way you are slow and deliberate when you understand that what you are doing will not be done again, that this is the only time this task will ever exist, and that the person in front of you deserves every moment of the care you are capable of giving. When the preparation was finished, Noah looked around the chamber one more time. The gifts Seth had placed there were still there. Gold, frankincense, myrrh, waiting. In the dry, in the dark, in the still. The same three objects that a son had placed beside his father's body in the language of prophecy, and Noah understood, or felt something close enough to understanding that it moved through him the way understanding moves when it arrives not in the mind first, but in the chest. These were not his to leave behind. The cave was going to be covered. The water was going to come. And what Seth had placed here with such deliberate intention in the language of objects that pointed forward towards something that had not yet happened could not be left in a cave under a flood for no one to find Enoch. So Noah gathered them carefully, the same way Seth had placed them, with full understanding that he was handling something that did not only belong to the past. Detentets. He came back up out of the cave into the air. That was already different from the air he had descended into. Heavier. The sky was the color of something that had made a decision, and Noah, with Adam beside him, and the three gifts of Seth in his hands, walked back toward the ark, carrying more than wood could carry, more than any measurement could contain. The first man on his way through the flood to wherever the line was going next. There is a question that most people never think to ask about the ark. Not about its dimensions, not about how the animals fit, not about the logistics of feeding and water, and the long weeks of floating over a world that no longer existed. Beneath it, the question is simpler than any of those. What else was on it? Tentent. Genesis gives you the animals. It gives you Noah and his family. It gives you the measurements, and the wood, and the pitch. But the Ethiopian tradition, asks a different question about the ark than Genesis does. It does not ask, how was it built? It asks, what was it carrying? And the answer, dear friend, is larger than most people were ever shown. Tentet. The concept I want to give you here comes from the Aksumite Christian tradition, the tradition of the ancient kingdom of Aksum, which became one of the first Christian kingdoms on earth, following the mission of Frumentius of Tyre in the 4th century of the Common Era. Frumentius, who is known in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition as Abba Salama, Keeper of Peace, was the first bishop of the Ethiopian Church. And the tradition he helped establish carried with it a theological understanding of sacred objects that shaped how the Ethiopian Church read every account of things being carried, transported, preserved through upheaval. That understanding is built around a concept that the Aksumite tradition inherited from the oldest layers of its faith, the concept of the Tabot. The Tabot. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, every church contains a Tabot, a consecrated tablet kept in the innermost chamber of the sanctuary. It is the holiest object. In the Ethiopian Christian tradition, and no church, in the Ethiopian understanding, is a church without one. The Tabot is not displayed. It is not shown to the congregation. It is kept, wrapped, protected, held in the innermost place where only the ordained may approach. And when an Ethiopian church is moved, or when a community travels, or when anything requires the church to be somewhere other than where it was built, the Tabot travels with it. Because without the Tabot, there is no church. The building is a building. The Tabot is the presence. Now, when the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition reads the account of Noah and the ark, it reads it through this understanding. The ark was not only a vessel for biological survival, it was a vessel for sacred carrying and calm. And what Noah placed on the ark from the cave of treasures was understood by the Ethiopian tradition in exactly the way the Tabot is understood in the Ethiopian Church today, as the presence that must travel when everything else is in motion, as the thing that cannot be left behind when the world is being unmade and remade. The ark in the Ethiopian theological reading was a moving sanctuary, and Adam's body was its Tabot. I have sat with that longer than I expected to, because it changes what the ark means. Not a lifeboat, a sanctuary moving across the water, carrying the holiest thing the human world possessed, the body of the one from whom all of it had come. Tact. The Gizeh word I want to give you here is the word the Ethiopian tradition uses.
Kidus,
The word
Ixi Abher.
Nəśśä. Giz, Nəśśä, does not mean simply to carry or to transport, or to move something from one place to another. Nəśśä carries the specific weight of a lifting, of taking something up with both hands, with the full understanding, ging, of what is being held. The Ethiopian liturgical tradition uses this word for the specific act of lifting the Tabot during the Timkat procession, the Ethiopian Orthodox celebration of the Epiphany, when the Tabot is carried out of the church.
Receive these offerings, O Lord. Grant rest to your servant Adam.
It is one of the most sacred acts in the entire Ethiopian Orthodox liturgical year, and the word for that carrying is Nəśśä, a lifting with full knowledge of what is being held. The Ethiopian tradition applies this word to what Noah did when he took Adam's body from the cave and brought it to the ark. Noah performed Nəśśä. He lifted with full knowledge. He carried with full understanding. He moved through the world toward the ark with the first man held in exactly the way the most sacred objects of the Ethiopian tradition are held. During the holiest moments of the liturgical year, not casually, not efficiently, as an act of worship. Now, alongside Adam's body, Noah also carried the three gifts Seth had placed in the cave: gold, frankincense, myrrh. And the Ethiopian tradition is specific about why these three things could not be left behind. It is not only because they were valuable. In the Ethiopian theological reading, these objects were not treasures in the sense of wealth. They were treasures in the sense of the word the cave itself carried. A treasury is not a place where wealth is stored. A treasury, in the ancient understanding, is a place where things of meaning are held until the moment of their meaning arrives, and the meaning of gold, frankincense, and myrrh had not yet arrived. When Seth placed them beside his father in the cave, the meaning was still ahead, still waiting in a future that even the flood was not going to interrupt. So they had to travel on the ark through the water to the other side, where the world would begin again. And the thread from Seth's act of prophecy would still be running, intact, unbroken, waiting to reach what it had always been pointing toward: Denelakt, the ark on the water. 40 days of rain, and then the long weeks of floating. And in the interior of that vessel, in whatever space Noah had prepared, with the same deliberateness he had brought to everything else, Adam rested through the flood. The first man traveling through the destruction of the world he had helped make necessary, not as a trophy, not as a relic in the collecting sense, as a continuity, as the thread, them, that connected the world before the water to the world after it, as the proof that what had been begun in a garden was not going to end in a flood. The Ethiopian tradition holds that Noah understood this, that the act of carrying Adam was not only an act of filial reverence toward an ancestor. It was a theological statement known, a declaration made in the language of action rather than words, that the story of humanity was still going, that it had not been erased by the water, that the first chapter was still in the vessel, still present, still held, traveling toward whatever chapter came next. Tenitet, and here, dear friend, I want to stay with something for just a moment before we move forward, because what Noah did on that ark is something that I think most of us understand more deeply than we realize. Us. We all carry something from those who came before us. Not always a body. Sometimes a word they spoke once that has never left us. Sometimes a way of doing something that we learned from watching without ever being taught. Sometimes a grief that was theirs first and became ours by the simple fact of loving them. Sometimes a faith that was handed to us before we were old enough to choose it and has been ours ever since. We carry these things through our own floods, through the seasons when the world as we knew it goes underwater, and we do not always know why we are carrying them. We only know that setting them down feels like losing something we were entrusted with. Noah knew that feeling. On the water, with Adam in the vessel, with the rain still coming down outside, he did not know exactly where the ark was going. He only knew that what he was carrying had to arrive somewhere on the other side. And so he held it through all of it, the way you hold what was given to you by people who trusted you with something they could not carry any further themselves. Dedensots, the water receded. The ark came to rest, and Noah, with Adam, still in the vessel, with the three gifts of Seth still wrapped and held, stepped out onto ground that had been washed clean, and the task was not finished, because carrying something through the flood is only half the work. The other half is where to set it down on the other side. Wait, and the Ethiopian Bible has an answer for that too, a specific one, with a location, with a hill, with a name. That will mean something to you when you hear it. That is where we are going. Dear friend, I want to step out of the story for just a moment, not away from it, just to the edge of it, where I can speak to you a little more directly. There is something in Noah's task tonight that I have not been able to move past quickly the fact that he carried something he did not fully understand. That he was faithful to an inheritance whose full meaning had not yet arrived. And I think some of you tonight are doing exactly that. Nar, you are carrying something from someone who is gone now, a faith they passed to you, a way of seeing the world that came from their hands into yours before you were old enough to ask for it. And there are nights when carrying it feels less like a gift and more like a weight. When you are not sure if what you are holding still belongs to you, or if you are holding it only because you do not know how to set it down without feeling like you are betraying someone who trusted you with it. I do not have a clean answer for that tonight. What I have is this. Noah did not understand everything he was carrying either, and he carried it anyway, through water that covered everything he had ever known, and what he carried arrived intact, in the right place, at the right time. That is not nothing, dear friend. That is not nothing. The water was gone. Not all at once, not dramatically, the way we sometimes imagine floods ending, with a sudden pulling back, a sudden reveal of everything that had been underneath. Slowly, the way water always leaves when it has nowhere urgent to go. Receding by degrees, revealing the earth, inch by inch, the way a patient thing reveals itself to someone willing to wait for it. And the earth that appeared as the water pulled back was not the earth Noah remembered. It was washed, stripped, everything that had accumulated in the centuries between Eden and the flood, the cities, the roads, the places where people had gathered and built and named things and argued about the names. All of it gone. And in its place, something that felt almost like a beginning. Almost. Because Noah knew it was not a beginning. He was carrying the evidence that it was not a beginning. Adam was still with him. The first chapter was still present in the vessel. And now that the vessel had come to rest and the ground was firm enough to walk on, Noah had to finish what Seth had started. Delent, the Ethiopian tradition, is more specific about what happened next than almost any other surviving account. And the specificity is the kind that stays with you long after you have closed the text, because the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition does not describe Noah choosing a location for Adam's reburial based on convenience or proximity or the practical considerations of a man with many tasks and limited time. It describes Noah being directed, given a specific place, with a specific name that the tradition had been pointing toward since before the flood. since before Seth built the cave, since before Adam himself had left the garden and begun the long education of living outside it. The place was a hill, and the name of that hill, dear friend, is Golgotha detlacht now. I want to be careful here, the way I am always careful when a detail this significant appears in a text, because the word Golgotha carries so much weight in the Christian tradition that it is easy to let that weight do the interpretive work before we have actually read what the Ethiopian text says. So let me give you what the text says first, and then let you feel the weight of it yourself. The Ethiopian tradition, drawing on the theological understanding preserved in the Tewahedo Church and cross-referenced in the commentary tradition of the Aksumite Christian scholars who received both the Syriac cave of treasures and the Ethiopian Synaxarium as part of their canonical inheritance, holds that Adam's body was carried by Noah after the flood and reinterred at a specific hill in the land that would become the center of the biblical narrative, the same hill where the three gifts of Seth, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, would eventually be presented by three men who had followed a star to find someone they had been looking for. The same hill where the meaning that Seth had encoded in the language of objects Bitsa, his side, father's body, in the cave, would finally arrive at its destination. Tinatatengt, the Giaz word I want to give you here, is the word the Ethiopian tradition uses for this specific act of reburial of Adam at Golgotha. The word is Astäwäldä. Astäwäldä. In Gez, this word carries a meaning that the English word reburial does not contain. Astäwäldä means to restore to origin, not simply to bury again, to return something to the place it was always going to end up, the place that was its destination. Before the journey began, the Ethiopian scribes, who copied this word into the liturgical records in the stone churches of Lalibela, in the island monasteries of Lake Tana, understood Noah's act at Golgotha not as a practical decision about where to bury an ancestor, but as a completion, a restoration to origin. The body of the first man arriving at the place where the full meaning of the first man's story would eventually become visible. Daton talks. Now, the Ethiopian tradition goes one step further than almost any other account in what it records about Noah's act at Golgotha. It records that Noah did not perform this burial alone. Shem was with him, Noah's eldest son, the one from whose line the biblical narrative would continue to descend. And the Ethiopian text preserves a specific detail about what Shem understood as he stood beside his father at that hill and helped lower Adam into the ground. Shem understood, according to the Ethiopian record, that this was not the end of Adam's story at this location. It was the beginning of what this location would one day mean. The Ethiopian tradition holds that Shem was given, in the moment of that burial, a knowledge of what Golgotha was being prepared for, not in explicit detail, not in the kind of clear prophetic vision that announces itself with signs and dates and specific names, but in the way that certain moments give you the feeling of something much larger moving through them, the feeling that what is happening in your hands right now is a small part of something that began before you and will continue long after. Shem felt that Tem on the hill with his father and the body of the first man between them, and the Ethiopian text records that he wept, not from grief only, from the weight of understanding something too large for the moment to fully contain. I want to stay with the image of that hill for a moment, because what the Ethiopian tradition is describing here is something that I find quietly astonishing when I read it slowly. The same ground, the same specific hill, holding Adam from the time of Noah forward, or through every century of the biblical narrative, through Abraham, through the kings, through the exile, through the return, holding Adam in the ground, while the story that his existence had made necessary unfolded above him, century by century, until the moment that the three objects Seth had placed beside the body in the cave of treasures found their recipient. And the Ethiopian tradition holds that in that moment, the ground of Golgotha was not only the site of what was happening above it, it was also the resting place of the one for whose sake all of it was happening. The first man below, the answer to the first man's story above, the same hill, holding both at once, detalektatent. Now, there is a specific detail in the Ethiopian theological tradition that I want to give you here very carefully, because it is the kind of detail that sounds like poetry when you first hear it, and then you sit with it longer, and you realize it is not poetry. It is the Ethiopian Church's most precise theological statement about what Golgotha means. The statement is this: the blood that fell on Golgotha fell into the ground, and the ground received it, and what the ground held received it. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition does not present this as metaphor. It presents it as the completion of the thread that Seth began when he placed a body in a cave with three objects and an instruction that the body must not be left behind when the world was washed the body was not left behind. Noah carried it through the water to the hill, and the hill phlegm held it. Until the thread reached its end, this dear friend is what the Ethiopian Bible kept, not a myth, not a legend, not a beautiful story that makes people feel connected to something ancient, a theological argument made in the language of bodies and caves and hills and specific acts of carrying and reburial and restoration to origin. An argument that says the story of humanity has never been interrupted, that the flood did not break the thread, that the cave did not end the story, that the body of the first man traveled through the worst thing the world had ever experienced and arrived at exactly the place it was always going, and waited there, in the ground, for the rest of the story to catch up, tentakite, the same hill, the same ground, centuries apart, and not one moment of that long holding was accidental. Not Seth's hands placing the body in the cave, not Enoch's knowledge passed through Methuselah, through Lamech, to Noah, not Noah's descent into the cave before the rain, not the ark carrying what the flood could not be allowed to erase, not Shem, weeping on the hill with the weight of something too large for the moment to contain. Not one moment was accidental, and the Ethiopian Bible kept every single one of them when almost no one else thought to ask whether they mattered. There is a moment in the history of every tradition when someone has to decide what stays, not what is true, not what is beautiful, not what is ancient or carefully preserved or loved by the communities that have carried it. Simply, what stays, what goes into the canon, and what does not. And those decisions, made in specific rooms by specific people, in specific centuries, shaped what most of us were ever shown of the sacred record. The Council of Laodicea in 363 of the Common Era made its decisions. The Council of Carthage in 397 of the Common Era made its decisions, and the tradition that most of the world inherited was shaped by those rooms and those people and those specific centuries. But there was another room in another tradition where different decisions were being made. At roughly the same time, on a highland in the northeast of Africa, where an ancient kingdom was in the middle of becoming something new 10 tots. The kingdom of Aksum. By the 4th century of the Common Era, Aksum was one of the great powers of the ancient world. Its trade routes connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Its obelisks, the great carved granite stelae, still standing in the field at Aksum to this day, marked a civilization that understood permanence in a very specific way. Not the permanence of empire, which the Aksumites knew, as well as anyone, was always temporary. The permanence of stone placed deliberately to point in a specific direction for as long as stone is capable of pointing. And into this kingdom, in the early decades of the 4th century, came a young man from Tyre. His name was Frumentius. Dotlakt. Now, the story of Frumentius is one I want to give you carefully tonight, because it is usually told as a simple conversion story, a shipwreck, a young scholar who ends up at the Aksumite court, rises to a position of influence, and introduces Christianity to the king. And that is part of it. But the part that matters for tonight is what Frumentius brought with him into that relationship with the Aksumite tradition, and more importantly, what the Aksumite tradition brought to its reading of what Frumentius carried. Dotlakt. The Ge'ez word I want to give you here is the word the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition uses for the process by which the Aksumite scholars received, evaluated, and ultimately kept the texts that other traditions were setting aside. The word is mazgaba. Mazgaba. In Ge'ez, mazgaba means to treasure, not to store, not to archive, not to preserve in the passive sense, of something that simply survives because no one destroyed it. To treasure. In the active sense of choosing something, understanding its value, and making a deliberate decision to hold it as something precious. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, in the centuries following Frumentius, performed mazgaba with texts that the councils of the Western tradition were in the process of setting aside. And the question that I have sat with longer than I expected to is why did the Aksumite tradition treasure what others set aside? What did they see in the cave of treasures in the Ethiopian Synaxarium's account of Adam's burial, in the specific detail of Noah carrying that body through the flood to Golgotha? What did they see that other traditions decided they could live without? I think the answer has something to do with how the Aksumite tradition understood the body, not theologically only, practically numb. The Aksumite Christians who inherited the faith that Frumentius helped establish lived in a world where sacred objects were not abstract. The Tabot was physical. The church was physical. The liturgy was physical, spoken aloud in a language which the body could feel as well as the mind could follow. Ge'ez, the liturgical tongue, that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has never stopped using in its services, in its ordinations, in its readings from the canon, is a language that is experienced as much as understood. The Ethiopian Orthodox liturgy is one of the longest and most physically demanding in the Christian world. Services that begin before midnighting and continue through the night. Priests and deacons standing, chanting, moving for hours in the stone churches on the cold highland floor. The body is not incidental to this tradition. The body is the instrument through which the faith theme is practiced. And so, when the Aksumite scholars encountered the account of Adam's body, of Adam's carried through the flood, reinterred at Golgotha, held in the ground, until the thread Seth had begun reached its completion. They did not read it as mythology. They read it as consistent with everything they already understood about how the sacred moves through the world, in bodies, in specific places, through specific acts of carrying and placing and holding neglect. Now, the decision to keep these texts in the Ethiopian canon was not made in a single moment. It was made over centuries by the abbots of the great monasteries, by the scholars of the Aksumite tradition, by the scribes who copied these texts generation after generation in the stone rooms of the highland. And the scribes matter here, dear friend, because a scribe who copies a text is not a passive instrument. A scribe who spends months copying a manuscript by hand in the compressed silence of an underground room by lamplight lives with that text, knows it the way you know something you have spent months moving through word by word. And the scribes of the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition who copied the Cave of Treasures account, who copied the Synaxarium references to Adam's burial, to Noah's carrying, to Shem's weeping on the hill, understood what they were holding. They were not copying mythology in the sense of stories that explain things symbolically without claiming physical reality. They were copying the physical record of what had happened to the first human body after it was finished, and they treated it with the same care, with the same they brought to every other physical record in the canon, because for them there was no distinction between the physical and the sacred. The physical was where the sacred lived. Detects the Western tradition in setting aside these texts was not making a careless decision. I want to say that plainly. The councils that shaped the Western canon were made up of serious people wrestling with real questions about what the Church needed to teach and what it could not afford to have misunderstood. A text that gave Adam a specific grave at a specific location raised questions that certain councils did not want to answer in a public document available to everyone. What does it mean for the body of the first man to be in the ground at Golgotha. What does that proximity say about the nature of what happened there? Is this a claim the Church wants to make officially? The Western councils decided that the answer to that last question was no, not because the account was false necessarily, but because it was specific in a way that opened more questions than the councils felt equipped to manage. And so it was set aside, and the Ethiopian tradition kept it, because the Ethiopian tradition was not afraid of specific questions. It was built on the belief that specific questions deserve specific answers, and that the body is where specific answers always live. Didn't what the Ethiopian scribes understood that the Western tradition, in its canonical decisions, stepped back from, is something that I find deeply moving when I sit with it slowly. They understood that the story of humanity needed a physical thread running through it, not only a spiritual one, not only a theological argument made in the language of doctrine and council decisions and carefully worded creeds, a physical thread, a body carried through a cave, through a flood, through centuries of waiting in the ground of a specific hill. The Ethiopian canon kept that thread intact, and tonight, dear friend, that thread is in your hands. The same thread that Seth began when he built the cave and placed his father inside it with 3 objects and an instruction. The same thread that Enoch carried in his knowledge of how to preserve what time would otherwise take. The same thread that Methuselah held for 9 centuries without dropping, that Lamech passed forward 5 years before his death to a son who would need it in ways Lamech could not yet see, that Noah carried through the water with both hands all the way to a hill that was waiting to receive it, that the Ethiopian scribes copied and recopied and kept copying in the stone rooms of the highland, in the lamplight, in the compressed silence of 15 centuries of deliberate keeping, until tonight, when it arrived here, in this hour, in this room, in whoever stayed long enough to receive it, Tewahedo. The study is done now, dear friend. The text has spoken everything it came to say tonight. The cave, the body, the carrying, the hill, the thread, all of it spoken. And now, we move from the mind into something quieter, from the study into the rest that the study was always pointing toward. Let the teaching settle now, not into argument, not into more questions. Tonight, into the bones, into the breath, into the breath, into the slow, faithful, unhurried dark that has been gathering in the room around you Since long before this account began, there is a forest. You do not need to find it. It has already found you. It was here before you arrived at this hour, before the account began, before the first word of tonight's study was spoken. It was waiting, the way forests wait, without urgency, without the need to announce themselves, simply present, the way very old things are present when you finally grow still enough to notice them. The trees here are not the trees of a forest you have walked through in daylight. They are older than that. Their trunks are wide in the way that takes centuries to become, wide in the way that makes you feel, without being told, that something has been standing here since before the ground. Beneath it had a name. The bark is darker, not the dark of something unhealthy, not the dark of something that has been through difficulty and carries it visibly. The dark of something that has been here through every kind of weather and is simply itself. Deep, settled, untroubled, the ground beneath your feet is soft, not wet. Soft in the way of ground that has received many years of falling leaves and slow rain and the patient work of roots pressing gently downward through decade after decade of quiet growing. It gives slightly under your weight. Not enough to notice if you were moving quickly. But you are not moving quickly. You are barely moving at all. And the ground receives that. Receives the weight of you, standing here in the dark, under these trees, at this hour, without effort, without complaint, simply holding that mullet, cullet. There is a river. You can hear it before you can see it. Not far, close enough that the sound of it has been in the air since you arrived. You simply did not notice it until now, because it is that kind of sound. The kind that does not interrupt. The kind that was already there, underneath everything else, and only becomes audible when everything else has gone quiet enough to stop covering it. You can hear it now. Moving, not rushing, not the sound of water in a hurry to be somewhere else. Moving the way water moves when it has found the course it was always going to find and is simply following it without resistance, without the energy of something fighting its own direction, simply moving in the way it has been moving through this forest since before the forest.
And so the light illuminated the darkness, revealing the ancient words of truth.
Continuous, like a voice that has been speaking for so long, it has stopped being words and become something underneath words, something the body understands without the mind having to translate it water moving over stone in the dark of an ancient forest at the hour when everything that needed to happen today has already happened, and what remains is only this: the sound and the dark and the soft ground under your feet and the wide trees standing around you like something that has always been here, holding the space for exactly this Poppertlands. There is a fire, not large. You did not build it. It was already burning when you arrived, the way things are sometimes, already prepared when you reach a place that was waiting for you. It sits in a small clearing between the trees, a clearing just large enough for the fire and for you. Nothing else is required. The fire does not need to be tended tonight. It knows what it is doing. It has been burning at this size in this clearing for as long as you need it to, and will continue for as long as you need it to, without asking anything from you in return. You do not need to feed it. You do not need to watch it to make sure it does not go out. You only need to be near it to tendlate. The warmth of it reaches you, not the sharp warmth of something too close, not the warmth that asks you to step back. The warmth of something at exactly the right distance. The warmth that finds the places in the body that have been holding tension since before you lay down tonight, and gently, one by one, without asking permission, releases them. The shoulders. Feel the warmth finding the shoulders. Whatever they were holding, they have held long enough. The warmth asks nothing. It only offers. And the shoulder, in the presence of something that only offers and does not ask, begin to understand that they do not have to hold anymore tonight or plot. The firelight moves. That is what firelight does. When it is not behind glass, when it is not contained in something designed to keep it still, it moves gently, the way breath moves when the body has stopped asking it to be anything other than what it is. The light touches the nearest trees on one side, and then, as the fire shifts slightly, on the other, and the shadows between the trees move with it, not dramatically, slowly, the way shadows move at this depth of night, when the only light is a small fire in a clearing, and the only sound is the river moving through the dark on its ancient course. The shadows are not alarming. They are company. The moving dark between the old trees is not absence of light. It is the presence of the forest being what it is in the hours when it does not need to be observed to continue, and you are inside that, held inside it. The way the clearing holds the fire, and the fire holds the warmth and the warmth holds you without effort, without asking, simply holding, propellant. Let the breath go now. Not the breath you are controlling, the one underneath that, the one the body knows how to take when the mind has finally stepped back from managing it. That breath, it is slower than you think, slower than the breath you take when you are awake and moving through the world, slower and deeper, the kind of breath that fills the body all the way down to the places that daytime breathing rarely reaches. Let it go there, down into the low places, down where the body keeps the things it does not show the world, the tiredness it has been carrying since longer ago than today, the weight that accumulates not in a single day, but over the long weeks of being a person in the world. That weight, the breath knows about it. The slow, deep breath of this hour in this clearing, by this fire, knows exactly where it lives in the body and moves through it slowly, the way the river moves through the forest, not forcing, not demanding, simply following the course it was given, and the weight moves with it, loosening, releasing, not all at once, the way the forest floor releases moisture after rain slowly into the air over the long hours of the night. That slowly, that completely, at Betalit. The river is closer now, or you are closer to it. It is difficult to tell at this depth of night whether you moved or whether the forest simply rearranged itself gently to bring the sound nearer to you. It does not matter. The sound is here, low, low, continuous, water over stone in the dark. And if you let the sound move through you the way the breath just moved through you, not listening to it exactly, but receiving it the way Räʻyä. Receive something through the senses that cannot be unreceived. If you receive the sound of the river that way, it does something to the thinking mind, something gentle. It gives the thinking mind something to follow, and the thinking mind, when it has something to follow, that goes on and on and on, without changing, without arriving anywhere, without requiring a response, begins to do something. It very rarely does. During the waking hours, it lets go, not dramatically, quietly, the way a hand lets go of something it has been holding, not from intention, but from the simple fact that it has grown too heavy with sleep to hold on. Any longer, propellant, the fire settles. A small sound, not alarming. The sound of wood that has been burning long enough to become something other than wood. Something lighter. Something that holds the shape of what it was without the weight. Like a thought, at the edge of sleep, that still has the shape, of a thought. But no longer the weight of one. The fire settles, and the light shifts slightly, and the shadows between the trees move with it, and the clearing feels very, very slightly larger than it did a moment ago, as if the forest is making more room for the quiet that is gathering here, for the stillness that has been approaching from the far edges of the trees since you arrived, and is now almost here, detentlant, almost pretlant. Adam rested in the dry, in the dark, in the still, for centuries, not because rest was a consolation for what had been lost, but because rest is what the body returns to when it has done everything it came to do. The cave held him, the ark carried him, the hill received him. And through all of it, through the carrying and the water and the long waiting in the ground of the hill, what the body was doing was resting, the deepest rest, the kind that does not require anything from the one resting. No effort, no maintenance, no continuous application of intention against the possibility of waking. Simply rest, and the thread ran on above him, century by century, finding its way toward the completion it had always been moving toward, while the body rested in the ground that was holding it, the way this forest is holding you now. Pottiklant. The river does not stop. That is the thing about rivers, Nap, at this depth of night. They do not stop because you have stopped listening to them. They continue. Whether or not Anyon is awake to hear them, and in the continuing, in the low, constant, unhurried movement of water over stone in the dark, there is something the body recognizes, a permission. The river is moving, so you do not have to. The fire is burning, so you do not have to tend it. The forest is standing, so you do not have to hold anything up. The trees have been here through every kind of night this forest has ever received, and they will be here through this one. You are not needed for any of it to continue, and that, dear friend, is the most restful thing in the world. To be somewhere that does not need you to keep it going, that will continue exactly as it is, whether you are watching or not, whether you are thinking or not, whether you are awake or not. Titanlix, the breath is finding its own level now. You can feel it, or perhaps you can no longer feel it distinctly, which is the same thing, in the direction this night is moving. The breath that requires attention is the breath of the waking mind. The breath that requires no attention, that continues without the participation of anything that is still trying to stay alert. That is the breath of a body that has finally been given permission to do what it was made to do at this hour. And you have that permission. You have had it since before you lay down tonight. The forest has been holding it for you in the clearing, by the fire, near the river, under the old trees, waiting for exactly this moment, when the body and the permission find each other. Potlon Hermai. Let the fire be the last thing, not the words, not the story, not the cave, or the body, or the body, or the hill, or the thread running through the centuries. Let all of that rest now, the way Adam rested, in the dark, in the keeping, without effort. Let the fire be the last thing the eyes hold. Before the eyes stop holding anything, the small warm light in the clearing, moving gently the way breath moves, the way the river moves, the way the shadows between the old trees move when there is nothing urgent asking them to be still. Let it move. Let the light move, and the shadow move, and the breath move, and the river move. And let you be still inside all of that moving. The one still thing in the clearing, held by the trees, by the warmth, by the sound of the river, by the soft ground that has been receiving everything the forest gives it for longer than anything alive can remember, and is receiving you now in exactly the same way, without distinction, without condition, without asking whether you deserve the softness of this ground. You are here, and the ground receives you. That is enough. That has always been enough, Pretlands. The fire is lower now, not out, lower, the way good fires go. At the end of a long night, not dramatically, not all at once, simply settling into themselves, into the deep amber that lives underneath. The flame, the part that is not burning exactly, but glowing, the part that does not need the flame anymore to be warm, that has received enough warmth over the long hours of the night to hold it on its own. For as long as it is needed, you are like that now. The part of you that was still burning with the day, with the account, with the questions, the story opened in you. That part has settled into something quieter, something that glows rather than burns, something warm and low and present, without the effort of flame boppertalland. The river still moving in the dark, over the stone. It has been moving over since before anyone gave this river a name. The same water, the same stone, the same sound. Night after night after night, whether anyone was listening or not. It moved, and it is moving now, and it will be moving when you wake. Somewhere in the direction this forest goes when you are not watching, still moving, still the same low, continuous, unhurried sound of water that has found its course and follows it. Without resistance, without the energy, Ming, of something fighting its own direction, simply moving prevalent. The old trees, air standing, you do not need to look at them to know they are there. You can feel them in the quality of the air, in the specific stillness that only exists inside a forest that has been here long enough to have its own way of being quiet. They are standing, as they have stood through every night this forest has ever received. Through storms, through long dry seasons, through the slow accumulation of centuries, pressing gently down on everything below them, and through nights like this one, quiet nights, nights when someone came and sat near a small fire in a clearing and listened to the river and let the weight of the day and the week and the long season being alive release into the soft ground beneath them. The trees have held those nights, and every one of them, and they are holding this one, holding you in the dark, without effort, the way everything in this clearing holds without effort. Tonight, Grättrat. Sleep is not a place you go. That is not how it works. It is a place that comes to you when you have stopped moving toward it, when you have stopped trying to arrive.
In the heart of the mountain, the elder studies the sacred texts by the light of the flickering flame.
Beside the fire. With everything else you set down tonight, it comes the way the river came into your hearing, not because you went looking for it, because you grew still enough for it to find you, and you are still enough now. Tautnetlet. The thread is at rest. The cave is holding what it was built to hold. The hill is holding what was carried to it. The forest is holding what came and sat beside its fire tonight. And the river is moving in the dark over stone without you, continuing the way everything that was kept on your behalf tonight continues, whether you are watching or not. Tenet. You are held, dear friend, in the forest by the fire near the river, under the old trees, held the way Adam was held, in the cave, in the ark, in the ground of the hill, not because he earned it, simply because the place that was prepared for him received him, and the place prepared for you tonight is here, Tenetlats. Rest now, Tenetlats. The river will hold Tenetlats. The fire will hold Tenetlats. The forest will hold Tenelet. The old trees will hold Tenelet. And everything that was carried through the long night of this account is holding you now, Datanot. Let it, Datanot.